Good evening, Lewes. I am Russ Huxtable. I'm delighted to be here, and we want to thank you for your patience as we get this event kicked off. And what a wonderful evening to celebrate our nation's independence. Tonight, we turn the clocks back to January 10th, 1776, when Thomas Paine published Common Sense. The pamphlet changed the course of our history by inspiring colonial men and women to embrace freedom. But before we do so, loads of hard work, combined with a few miracles, made the days leading up to this event possible. First, we want to thank Ron Collins for conceiving this event and for reaching out to his friend, Congressman Raskin, to return to Lewes to participate in this evening's program. I also want to thank the Delaware State Police and the Lewes Police who responded quickly with officers for our mutual safety. Thank you. Thanks as well to the remarkable staffs of Congressman Raskin and Congresswoman McBride for their invaluable assistance to tonight's event. I also want to thank the Mayor Marasco for conceiving of Lewes 250 and the events that will be celebrating our nation's history so robustly and honestly this year. So following the exchange between Ron Collins and Congressman Raskin, Mayor Marasco will come up on stage to present a sampling of the questions you submitted when you registered for this event. The Congressman will then respond to those questions. As a reminder to all, make sure you are in the know about upcoming events by signing up at lewes250.com. So finally, and by way of some common sense advice, please be sure to silence your cell phones. Please no video recording of tonight's conversation, and please be considerate and civil to all. With that, I welcome you all for an engaging, illuminated by the words of Thomas Paine as channeled by tonight's special guest. This is a fitting event for Lewes, Delaware, as Paine lived in Lewes, England, for 6 years prior to migrating to America. And now it is my great pleasure to hand things over to my friend and my former colleague in the Delaware General Assembly and introduce our remarkable Congresswoman, Sarah McBride.
Good evening. Good evening, Lewes. It is wonderful to be here with you all. It is wonderful to be here tonight with so many friends, with Mayor Marasco. Thank you so much for bringing us all together tonight. Thank you so much to the Lewes Library and, of course, to Cape Henlopen High School for facilitating this space for all of us, because we had such an incredible turnout this evening to hear from truly one of my favorite new colleagues, Representative Jamie Raskin. I'm so grateful to be here with Representative Raskin and Senator Huxtable. I had the chance to serve with Senator Huxtable for 2 years in the state Senate. And I can tell you that the two most thoughtful colleagues that I have ever had in my entire life are here with us tonight, Senator Huxtable and Representative Raskin. This year, we celebrate 250 years since the birth of an independent nation. But today, we celebrate 250 years to the day since the publication of a pamphlet that laid out the moral and intellectual case for independence. 250 years to the day since Thomas Paine told colonists to come together across difference and disagreements to ultimately fight for what we would call, 7 years later, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And while 250 years is the theme of this year, that is the other measure of time that has been top of mind for me over the last several months, fourscore. For those of you who aren't familiar with that archaic language, that means 80 years. And as I serve in Congress, I've been thinking a lot about that interval, 80 years. Because it does seem that in this country, every 80 years or so, we have an inflection point. The period of time when the last living memories of the previous inflection point die out. We had the revolution in the late 1700s. And then when the revolutionary generation dies out and living memory fades of that, we have a civil war. And then 80 years later, as some in this nation demand that we have here in the United States the strong men that we see in Europe, we learned the lesson of liberty and the importance of freedom once again when hundreds of thousands of Americans gave their lives fighting tyranny overseas. And now, we are once again 80 years from that inflection point. And we have a choice in this moment as a country. As we see the bonds of affection once again fray. As we see threats on our union, our Constitution, and our system of government. We have a choice in this moment at this inflection point once again. Will we learn from history, or will we repeat it? Will we learn those lessons by studying and listening to the people of the past? Or will we be doomed to learn those lessons through trial and tragedy? Tonight is about learning from history. Tonight is about listening to the voices of the past, heeding their lessons and the values that were articulated so powerfully 250 years ago today. And there is no better person to learn from than the person who I believe is the best teacher in Congress. And before I introduce Representative Raskin, any good history lesson is facilitated by a wonderful moderator. And tonight's conversation will be facilitated by someone many of you know, Ron Collins, the former Harold S. Shefelman Scholar at the University of Washington School of Law. He now serves as the Lewes Public Library Distinguished Lecturer and, of course, co-founded the History Book Festival. He will be in conversation tonight with someone who really needs no introduction. Someone many of us have been fans of for years. I first heard of Jamie Raskin when I was a student at American University, and he had just gotten elected to the Maryland House of Delegates and was a professor of law at American University. I never had the pleasure of being enrolled in a class with Jamie Raskin, but like so many of you, I feel like I have been educated by this incredible patriot for more than a decade now. In the Maryland General Assembly, he was the moral conscience of the Democratic caucus, leading the effort in that state to pass marriage equality among many other major progressive advancements. He was elected to Congress and quickly made a name for himself on the national stage, laying out the moral and intellectual case for dignity and justice for all. Often, great men are called to lead in moments of tragedy, and that is particularly true for Jamie Raskin. After experiencing unimaginable loss himself, the next day, after experiencing what every parent fears, he was also at the Capitol to certify the election results of the 2020 election. And like his colleagues at the time, including my colleagues in the Delaware congressional delegation, now Senator Lisa Blunt Rochester and Senator Coons, he witnessed an assault on our democracy. And in the face of both that personal and national tragedy, Jamie rose to the occasion, leading, among others, the effort to impeach the political leader who led that insurrection, Donald J. Trump. And since then, Jamie has brought forward his deep progressive values, his deep morality, and his deep intellect to lead our caucus now as the ranking member, and I may say so, soon chair of the House Judiciary Committee. You could say that Jamie Raskin is a modern day Thomas Paine, and he is certainly a modern day history. So please join me in welcoming my colleague and friend, Representative Jamie Raskin.
Congressman, can you all hear me? Welcome back to the first town in the first state. We're delighted to have you.
Well, I'm psyched to be here. Hello, you beautiful Lewes citizens. And thanks for inviting me, Ron. And I'm especially psyched to be here on this great, magnificent day, this incredible anniversary.
Now, we need to kind of, if you will, in the words of the boss, you can't start a fire without a spark. And we need you to be that spark. So in order to kind of channel Thomas Paine 250 years later, can I ask you if you just stand up in a dramatic and passionate way, inspire us with some lines from Thomas Paine? Would you mind?
Sure. All right. You didn't even really have to ask. I probably would have done it anyway. Well, you know, Paine got over here in 1774, 2 years before the American Revolution, and he fell in love with the promise of America. He said, if this land lives up to its ideals and its values, it will become, he said, an asylum to humanity. Not an insane asylum, mind you, but a place of refuge for people seeking freedom from political, religious, and intellectual persecution from all over the world. And then he wrote in 1776 the great pamphlet of our history, Common Sense, which ignited the American Revolution. George Washington had the troops reading it by campfire light out at Valley Forge. And it was the top-selling book in the country for a long time, top-selling pamphlet, although like most good authors, apparently he overstated the number of sales he was making. But anyway, but Paine, he wrote this other pamphlet in 1776 because, you know, it was a tough year and the country was split down the middle. We like to think that everybody was together in opposing King George and Parliament. Everybody was for the revolution, but it wasn't like that. The country was split right down the middle, not unlike a time we know ourselves. And I'm reading an interesting book about this now by H.W. Brand called The First Civil War, about how communities were split, families were split. You know, a lot of people were saying you can't beat the greatest military empire that ever existed. It's just not possible. You can't disentangle church and state. The governments have always controlled the churches for their own purposes. You can't put government on the principle of the rights and freedoms of the people. The kings govern and they get their power directly from God. And how do we know that? Because they told us they do, right? But then half of the people were running around trying with Tom Paine and Ben Franklin and Jefferson and Adams to figure out another path. And they were like, let's give it a try. Let's see if we can put government on a different idea, starting with the rights and freedoms of the people and the idea that government rests legitimately only on the consent of the governed, right? So the Declaration included that democratic idea, that libertarian idea of freedom, and also the idea of equality, that all of us are born equal, the idea that we would spend the rest of our history wrestling with. So anyway, but it was a tough year and nobody knew which way it was going to go. And Paine wrote this other pamphlet called The Crisis. So forgive me for quoting The Crisis, but this passage strikes me as maybe the most relevant to this moment. This one's me, let's see. So forgive me, I had the flu last week, which they said was over. I just have all of the effects of the flu still this week. So. These are the times that try men and women's souls. And let me back up for 1 second and just say, I'm correcting the language so as not to offend modern sensibilities, pursuant to strict instructions from Nancy Pelosi, who told me Tom Paine was a feminist, and that he was fighting for women's voting rights in the 18th century, and he wouldn't mind. And so that's why I'm taking a little bit of license there. Okay. These are the times that try men and women's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will shrink at this moment from the service of their cause and their country. But everyone that stands with us now will win the love and the favor and the affection of every man and every woman for all time. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, but we have this saving consolation. The more difficult the struggle, the more glorious in the end will be our victory. There we go. So, how's that? I can give you one from Common Sense if you want one.
Go ahead.
Or we'll do it at the end or whatever. That's fine.
Well, since you're ready.
Well, this one comes to mind too, because it's such a freezing cold day out there. Let the future world be told that in the depths of winter, when only hope and virtue could survive, both the city and the country, facing a common enemy, stood together for freedom. There we go.
I think the boss will be happy. That was the spark. Thank you, Jenny. So how is it that you came to Tom Paine? What was it about him that captivated you?
Well, I think I first read in high school, The Rights of Man, which they pair with Edmund Burke's reflections on the French Revolution, which was a great disappointment to Paine, of course, because Burke had been a supporter of the American Revolution. He was a supporter of the Irish cause. He was even opposed to British imperialism, colonialism in Burma. But he came out with this just, lacerating diatribe against the French Revolution. And in fairness, it turned out to be pretty dark for a lot of people, including for Tom Paine himself. But when it started, it did start with the ideals of the rights of man. And so, Burke spoke basically about, how dare anyone, touch the throne of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, and Paine wrote this answer, The Rights of Man, and he abstracted somewhat from the the politics of the French Revolution, which were complicated, but he talked about the only legitimating principle for government being democracy because of the equality of all people. You can view that as a secular revolutionary democratic concept or a religious concept, a moral precept. There are a lot of ways of understanding it, but both when you read Common Sense and you read The Rights of Man, it's very clear that Tom Paine took the position that from the standpoint of radical democracy, every other political system has the quality of the emperor's new clothes. It's somebody trying to dress up their own power, whether it's royal hereditary privilege, family rule, dictatorship, aristocracy, oligarchy, whatever it is, trying to dress up their own interests in some fancy language. But the only thing that admits of any intellectual honesty is the idea that everybody's interests have to count, everybody's values have to count, and that's what the creation of the democratic republics of the 18th century was all about. Paine, after participating so honorably and centrally in the American Revolution, he went to France. He was back in England for a while, then he went to France to participate in the French Revolution. He became a member of l'Assemblée Nationale. They made him an honorary citizen of France. But one of the extraordinary things about Paine was that he was willing to stand on principle even against his own allies. So in the same way that he was pressing abolition of slavery at a time when other people didn't want to talk about it during the American Revolution, he was trying to guarantee that the French Revolution would not move into the terrors that it did with Robespierre, and he took a very strong position against the execution of Louis XVI. And he said that just like France and America were abolishing monarchy, and really, America divorced itself from monarchy, but France would actually be abolishing monarchy. It should be the first country to abolish the death penalty, to abolish capital punishment. And as things turned darker in the French Revolution, he got thrown in prison. They, of course, had overthrown the Bastille, so that didn't exist anymore, but he was put in the prison at Jardin-Luxembourg, and he was there. He was very mad at George Washington, who he felt did nothing to get him out.
But James Monroe helped him.
But Monroe got him out when he was ambassador plenipotentiary.
So tell us just a little bit about the man. You said something already, but if you looked at the time when he lived in Lewes, England, you could have never imagined that he would be the figure that he became in the colonies. So tell us a little bit about the character of the man. What did he do before he came to the United States? And then he meets somebody in England that will shape his future.
Well, that was Ben Franklin. Look, Paine is an extraordinary figure, both intellectually and biographically for America. Intellectually, even the most radical patriots at the time, like Franklin or Jefferson or Adams, were a lot of them weren't even talking about independence. They felt like the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act and the Intolerable Acts were all assaults on liberty by the Parliament, and they wanted the king to rein in the Parliament against, against the colonists. But the breakthrough of common sense was to say, no, this is a revolution for the independence of America. And then even more radically than that, not for us to proclaim our own monarchy or our own aristocracy, but to found government on this new principle of being a democratic republic. You know, sometimes my colleagues give me a hard time. They say, you always talk about democracy, Raskin, but we're not a democracy. We're a republic. And they think they've struck some kind of major blow against my theory or something. I mean, a republic is just a representative democracy. That's what a republic is, because the room will not hold all, as we see tonight. You know, you're not going to fit 800,000 people into every room to vote. So we elect representatives to go and deliberate. But if you look at the entire history of our Constitution, it has moved progressively in a more democratic direction. And we've abandoned a lot of the anti-democratic features that were built into the original Constitution that Tom Paine was a critic of. For example, state legislative selection of U.S. senators. That's something that, you know, we got rid of in 1913 with the 17th Amendment, moving to popular election of senators away from selection by the legislative assemblies. The disenfranchisement of women we get rid of in the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing women the right to vote. And something that who knows whether we'll ever get around to it, but Tom Paine thought that the U.S. Senate was basically a kind of desecration of the Constitution, because we should have a unicameral body, one legislative body, and not one that would operate in a way to try to limit or put brakes on popular power and initiatives. So
you're going to stay in the House?
Well, you know, I already made that decision. You remember I had lymphoma when I was last contemplating that. But anyway, I mean, the Senate is, you know, clearly a problem.
So let me ask you this. As you know, the title, Common Sense, was not his. Benjamin Rush came up with the title. But why do you think the title is so important? And why do you think that that book, which sold 75,000 copies or thereabouts in the first 6 months, why did it catch on fire as much as it did? So first of all, Common Sense, what do you make of that title? Why is it important?
I think Tom Paine was in the habit of using the phrase, even though I guess Rush said that's the phrase that you should use for your book. And so, you know, my wife suggested the title for my last book, and I still feel it embraces both of us, you know. Look, the reason why it struck such a powerful nerve is because I think it served a double meaning. One, the way we often think of it is, you know, that person's got common sense. They've got the kind of sense you've got that you don't get at Oxford or Cambridge or, you know, in higher education. You've got a practical, pragmatic sense of how the world actually works. But it's got this double meaning. Common sense also means the sense we have in common, a sixth sense that we all have when we're willing to speak together, listen to each other, reason together on the theory that there is wisdom in crowds and that we're smarter collectively than we are on our own. And so I think both of those meanings took off. I mean, Paine obviously had a very powerful working class following. He was somebody who was generally scorned by the aristocrats. He was seen as, you know, ill-born, not properly educated. I mean, he was basically a failed cosset maker from England when he got over here. But at the same time, he was appealing to everybody. He was saying, look, this is a process that's going to include everyone together. It's going to take our common sense. And it just had an electrifying effect on the country.
Yeah, he said what was on everybody's minds, and he said it directly and boldly. You know, I mean, a number of people. And of course, we tend to forget that there, as Jamie had says, that there was great division in the colonies at the time. There were the loyalists, who were supportive of the king. There were those who were very pragmatic, we're not going to separate from England. And so it really did bring about revolutionary change. One of the great lines in Common Sense is, in America, the law is king. Now, he goes after the monarch, that despite the fact that Parliament passed all of these acts that were tyrannical. Tell us more about why he focused on the monarch and monarchy and in saying what he did. In America, the law is king.
Well, yeah, and the preface to that is saying in the absolute societies, in the monarchies, the king is the law. That should sound kind of familiar to you guys. What I say is the law. And he flipped it over and said, no, the law is king. And where does the law come from? That comes from a legitimated process of political consent being offered to our legislative representatives, and then the lawmaking procedures, right? So that's what replaces the idea that, I'm the king, l'état c'est moi. The only limit on my own power is my own conscience.
Now, this was in 1776, or?
Yeah, well,
Okay, all right.
his own conscience, that doesn't leave us a lot to hang on to.
So, sometime back, there was a lawmaker that proposed that there be a monument to one of the founders, namely Tom Paine, in Washington, D.C. I think you were that person.
Yes.
And
to show you how obsessed I really am.
And unless I'm mistaken, the president signed a bill to make that happen.
In 2022.
Congressman,
yes.
Where is that monument?
So, it's a kind of convoluted process to get through all the different steps. We're waiting for the Secretary of Interior, the sainted Mr. Burgum, to approve this. And I have every reason to believe he's going to do that. And does
the president have to sign that?
No, it's already been signed into law.
All right.
So now it's a series of administrative steps, and the National Capital Historical Monument Review Commission has recommended a place at 3rd and Constitution. So, I mean, it's just scandalous that we have no statue to Tom Paine, and we should be getting it up in a year or two, and maybe it would be a fitting end to this gloomy period that we've lived through. So,
as copies of Common Sense, all right, and it's still a book well worth reading, and it's more timely than realized, are available. Browse About Books is selling them, and I strongly urge you to get a copy. Mindful of our time, Congressman, what, in your opinion, are the important takeaways from Common Sense here 250 years later? Why is this a book that still speaks?
One thing we haven't talked about, Ron, is that Paine, who in some sense had libertarian style politics, he said that, society everywhere is a great virtue, but government is at best a necessary evil. And of course, he's looking at a period of unpopular government, royal monarchical government, and so he was very skeptical of government. But he posited that part of what should happen in American democracy and in constitutional democracies would be guarantees that everybody would get a certain subvention, a certain subsidy from the government at the age of majority to help them purchase a house and to get their life started. And that would be from a fund that starts in infancy, and money would be put in from, the point of their birth. People would also have security in old age. He saw this as not like a separate agenda from constitutional democracy, but essential to it, so that everybody would be able to belong and to participate. When, people would ask him, "Are you proud of the American Constitution?" And he said, "Well, when the prisons are empty of prisoners and the streets are empty of beggars, and the older people have sufficient means to live, then we can boast of our Constitution and we can boast of our government." So
Good words to live by. And unless I'm mistaken, I see our mayor in the wings. Will you please welcome our own mayor, Mayor Amy Marasco?
hello, Mayor Marasco.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Congressman Raskin and Ron, for an insightful conversation. I have been looking at your questions and trying to summarize some of those that we're going to ask this evening. But first, I just want to share a few things. What Congressman Raskin has done is let us think about the history, but bring it so relevant to today. Thomas Paine and our forefathers, and I would say our foremothers, remind us that democracy is not passive, it is hard work. Democracy is not something we admire from afar. It's something we practice, and we have to practice it over and over and over again. And common sense, real common sense, is not having all the answers. Rather, it comes from having the curiosity and courage to keep asking questions and to ask the next generations to keep asking questions as we work to form a more perfect union, a better government, and a better community for all. Lewes is a community that understands and appreciates history. That's why your conversation tonight resonates with all of us, because what we're trying to do is form that more perfect union. So let me go on to some of the questions, though you have answered some as well. The first one is, who's the Thomas Paine of today? Who can we look, in addition to you, Congressman, who is the Thomas Paine that we can look to for wisdom, advice, and inspiration?
Well, Paine was a pamphleteer, of course, and at a time right near the dawn of the printing press. So I assume we've got to look to the internet to see the people who are using the internet most effectively as a strategy for popular empowerment and democratic self-defense against assaults on freedom. And I know there's tons of them out there. So I probably don't want to start brainstorming particular names, but
well, that leads me into the second question that we heard, which is really, in 1776, the pamphlet system of disseminating information was pretty successful. But 250 years later, we are flooded with information noise, I would call it. So how would a new Tom Paine effectuate change in today's modern technology media landscape?
Well, let's see. Now, I mean, our focus is on common sense, of course, but his two great books were Common Sense and The Age of Reason, and he said you can't have one without the other. They go together. It was The Age of Reason that made him a bête noire and a pariah. because it was an attack on the role of organized religion in the perpetuation of violations of people's rights to speak, rights to publish, and so on. So I
Can I
guess
just pause for a second? Does somebody turn off their phone? Right, I'm sorry.
there we go. So I think that I mean it's a delicate task, and you can see how Tom Paine got in trouble because on the one hand, part of the democratic ethos is a belief in pluralism and everybody being able to do what they want to do, and pray as they want to pray, worship as they want to worship. At the same time, it is part of our political history that there are different religious groups that have used their power for purposes of demonizing, vilifying, persecuting, and oppression. And so, that's where Paine got in trouble. And I think for all the future Paines out there, I think that's where you need to go get in trouble, is to be dealing with that same kind of reality in America today, because we yeah, maybe I shouldn't say too much more about that. But, I'll come back when we do the Age of Reason.
So we have you committed.
Yes,
So-
exactly. That's what we heard. You spoke of it this briefly, but I think a little bit more of the flavor of this question is understanding the polarization of that time and the polarization of now. And I think a lot of the questions that came in were the frustration, the anxiety, the despair that we are feeling in loving our country, but not liking what's going on. What was it like for citizens of that time? How were they feeling? And how was Tom Paine hearing that?
And how's he?
How does he address it? How does Paine
Well,
really recognize?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think it's a very similar kind of thing. I mean, democracy is not a static system of just rules and responsibilities and rights. Democracy is a project. And at any moment in the history of democracy, there are very specific struggles taking place. Right now in America, the struggle for healthcare for all of the people is a classically pro-democracy struggle that is taking place. And so all I would say to people is don't feel despondent. I mean, the despair that you feel about this is the despair you feel in challenging and confronting injustice. And we've got a lot more people in America who want to move forward and make this a century of renewed democracy and freedom and justice, rather than those who really would like the rule of kings and dictators. And so that doesn't mean it's an easy fight. It's a tough fight. We're in the fight of our lives. I recognize that, but nobody is in it on his or her own. This is not, a 100-yard sprint or something like that. It's going to be a marathon, and we're going to do it together, and we're going to get through it, and we're going to be much tougher, much stronger when we get through it than when we first started out.
Congressman, I have two more questions from those who submitted ahead of time. And this is such a Lewes question because of the professional and expertise. I never have run a public meeting when someone says, I'd like to quote the Harvard Kennedy School, but that's how the question starts. The Harvard Kennedy School Political Science Department notes that nonviolent protests are twice as likely to succeed as armed conflicts. And those engaging a threshold of 3.5% of the population have never failed to bring about change. How did pain directly and indirectly galvanize this level of citizens' response? And this question is coming because many people in this audience are braving rain and snow and heat to stand up for democracy.
Well, I appreciate that. And let me say something about both parts of that. One, on nonviolent movements versus violent war. That point is absolutely right. I mean, if you think about our own lifetimes, I mean, I grew up with the idea of World War II being the great and virtuous war. It was a war of necessity, a war of democratic survival. But since then, you think about America's wars, it's very slim pickings in terms of successful wars. You think about the Vietnam War, which cost hundreds of thousands of lives. You think about the Afghan War, the Iraq War. There's not a great record of success with them. But what has worked is the nonviolent civilizing movements of our history. The civil rights movement of the 20th century, the women's movement, the LGBTQ movement, the labor movement, the peace movement, the human rights movement. Nonviolent movements have a much stronger track record of success. And as you say, those people at the Kennedy School have done a study, leave it at the Kennedy School to try to figure out what the percentage of the population is that needs to be involved. But I mean, Paine understood that intuitively, that you needed to speak to the people so that it was pervasive, so everybody was acting in unison. Those of us who aspire and attain to public office are nothing but the servants of the people. And this is why Lincoln said that in democracy, public opinion is everything. And with it, you can get anything done. Without it, you can't get anything done. So I guess if you put 3.578% of the people in the streets for the No Kings protests, we're well on our way. And I think that I got to speak in Philly at the last No Kings protest, and I just said, none of us is ever going to be a founding father from the 18th century, because some of us harbor that rather esoteric dream. But none of us is going to be a founding father from the 18th century, but all of us can be founding fighters in the 21st century. We can all do it.
There were lots of questions about hope and inspiration, and there were also comments that we are so fortunate in Delaware to have Congresswoman McBride represent us. Because anytime you hear from Sarah, you leave the room inspired. And though we support all of that in Delaware, we're very glad to have a visitor from Maryland, because Congressman Raskin, that is the comment about you, that you give us hope. So in the last question I want to pose today, as in 1776, these are the times that try our souls. What advice might Thomas Paine, and if you'd like a little bit to come from Jamie Raskin, that's fine, give us today to effect change for the common good? How might he give us hope and inspire us?
So I appreciate that. My dad used to say to us when we were kids, when everything looks hopeless, you're the hope. You were the hope. So I grew up with that sense of guilt and responsibility, but all of us can be the hope for a lot of other people who don't have the same resources available to us that we do. Every one of us can do that. Tom Paine said that he was somebody who really thought globally, and he fought globally too, but he said that the world is my country. My mind is my own church. And to do good is my religion. And that doesn't mean that he never got tired or exhausted or the flu. He got sick a lot of times. But it's to recognize that it's a team sport, and you might be down for the count for a few days, and others will come and stand in your place. Then if they get COVID or something, you're going to stand in their place. But democracy is a common project that was indeed a revolutionary and radical thing at the time of our revolution. A radical break from everything that had gone before it. Just the separation of church and state alone was a radical break from everything that was ever understood. And we're still fighting that all the time in Congress. One of my colleagues got up recently and said the moral downfall of America was in 1962 in Engel versus Vitale, when the Supreme Court banned prayer in the public schools. And I got up and I said, you know what? The Supreme Court never banned prayer in the public schools. As long as there are pop math quizzes, there will be prayer in the public schools. Anybody can pray whenever he or she wants to pray. And in fact, as long as Donald Trump is president, there will be prayer in the public schools. So anyway, so these ideas are still, they're well anchored in America, and I know in your hearts and in your minds, but still all over the world, people are living under thugs like Vladimir Putin and Viktor Orban and Xi and Erdogan, and you name it. And democracy is still the exception. Never forget that. Democracy and freedom are the exception. And Trump would like to align us with the authoritarian world. And we are the ones, the people in this room and in rooms like it all over America, although no place is cooler to be in America today than Lewes, Delaware. But it's the people in this room that are going to make sure that this is an exception that continues to thrive and prosper.
On a closing note, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, we're delighted to have you back in Lewes, and you're always welcome in the first town and the first state. I have to emphasize, you don't know what this man did to be here today to celebrate this 250th anniversary. So will you please join with me in thanking my dear friend and your friend, Jamie.
Thank you, Ron.
Congratulations. Thank you.